Hello there.
After my episode on Ancient Spartan Women, and after many requests and comments, I've finally gone around to making this episode, which will be on Ancient Athenian Women. I will go into great detail on the everyday life of Athenian women during the classical time period of ancient Greece. We're talking around 480 to 320 BC. I will also contrast them with their Spartan counterparts to reiterate the points made in the previous video. That being said, if you'd like to see that video, you can click right over here if I figure out how to put the link in. And again, the most significant part of all this is to dignify that Spartan women at this point in history were more or less the most powerful women possibly in the world in this time period, let alone in the region. Before we begin with being born in classical Athens, I would like to give credit to where it's due. Sarah Pomeroy is the main scholarly work I used to create this episode and the previous episode on Spartan women. She is quite frankly the best scholar on Greek women in antiquity. Please check out some of her work listed here. Hopefully I'll be able to list her books. And if you're wondering why there's two parrots beside me in this video, we have tried countless times, and you'll probably see cuts and edits. They keep screaming whenever they're away from me, so they have to be in every shot or they will make a lot of noise. Without further ado, Athenian women. So according to Sarah Pomeroy, infant mortality in classical Athens was perhaps 25%. Alongside this, Athens, like some other Greek city-states, practiced infanticide, which was directed towards girls more so than boys. Infanticide was done primarily when a baby showed deformities or abnormalities. Now, Athenians, like most Greek city-states, did not murder babies outright, as this was seen to be barbaric. They instead exposed the child to harsh conditions by leaving them outside. This was seen as technically not murder because the exposed child could potentially be saved and rescued by the gods or a nearby passing person. The idea, you see, was that parents would not be directly linked to the murder. These babies would be put in a clay pot or jar and deserted outside the front door on the roadway. In the ancient Greek religion, this practice took the responsibility away from the parents because the child would die of natural causes. For example, hunger, asphyxiation, or exposure to the elements. Now, Aristotle advocated this in the case of congenital deformity, stating, "As to the exposure of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live." This decision to expose a child was typically done by the father, unlike in Sparta, where it was done by a group of elders. Unfortunately, nearly any excuse passed as a reason to abandon a baby, especially for females. Now, not to paint this picture to be too dark, many cultures perform similar acts, and do remember a lot of these babies who were left out could be adopted by other families. It was quite common, though they usually became slaves to their adoptive family. Babies would not be given names until 7 to 10 days old because of the high rate of infant mortality. The ceremony for naming a baby was called, and I will reiterate this again in this entire video, I'm going to butcher all of these names, so I'm sorry, dekate. To notify the neighbors of birth, a woolen strip was hung over the front door to indicate a female baby was born, and if it was a boy, it would be an olive branch. Families did not always keep their new child. Babies would often be rejected if they were illegitimate, unhealthy, or deformed, or the wrong sex, and likewise a burden on the family as they would see fit. At the age of 3, a young Athenian boy tasted his first wine at the festive of Dionysus, and also served as a temple boy to assist in rituals. Boys took part in many religious activities. By the age of 7, boys began attending school in Athens. Wealthy boys were accompanied to school by their paidagogos. I know I butchered that one so bad. Think of it as a male tutor. Sometimes a male slave would take his master's son to school. Books were extremely rare and very expensive in ancient Greece. Students did their work on waxed covered tablets and stylus. Subjects taught were quite similar to today, math, so we're talking fractions, addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, reading and writing, such as through the words of Homer, music, usually with a lyre, or lyre, I think it's pronounced lyre, Physical education, sports, which was really important in Athens, like bow and arrow, sling, wrestling, running, swimming, and some of the more wealthy would learn horseback riding. By the age of 15, they were promoted to another school for their teen years. Now, by the age of 18, all boys were expected to attend a military school. And at the age of 20, most graduated. Often, many cities required young men to reach the age of 30 before participating in politics, and it was around this age when men would typically get married. Now, while boys went off to school at the age of 7, girls continued to stay at home until they were married. Quite different from Spartan women, who received the exact same education as their male counterparts. In fact, Spartan women were not only educated the same, they performed mostly the same physical activity, excluding some war-related activity. The lives of Athenian girls and slave children took a far different course than boys, however. Girls were not formally educated, but a few mothers, usually the wealthy ones, did privately teach their daughters to read and write. Since women were forbidden from participating in politics in Athens, there was no real reason to teach them literacy or numeracy. Some learnt to dance or play the instruments, though a good family did not consider musical instruments to be proper. Girls would assist their mothers in the home and sometimes work in the fields. The most important thing for a girl was to be instructed on her future role as mother. All girls were taught domestic jobs such as weaving, textiles, child rearing, embroidering, and cooking. Girls were almost never allowed to leave the house unless it was to attend specific festivals, funerals, and sometimes to visit their female neighbors. Certain rituals, such as the Ioria, probably butchered that one, which took place every spring, called upon girl involvement. This ritual was practiced to make up for the suicide of the legendary Athenian Eragon. It involved placing girls in a tree or swings to remember how Eragon hung herself over a tree, which is really dark if you think about it. Now, Spartan women were instructed through education and their mothers towards the most important role, which was motherhood, the same as Athens. However, this differed greatly. In Sparta, women were required to be physically fit in order to produce stronger children. They also did similar household work as Athenian women, albeit this was less emphasized. They didn't do as much knitting, let's say. Actually, their slaves did it mostly. Another interesting point to make is the dietary habits of males and females in classical Athens. The ideal Athenian wife, according to Xenophon in the Oikonomicus book VIIX, I'm so sorry to Greek viewers, was expected to control her appetite. You are probably assuming sex, but this was actually referring to food as well. You see, eating less was less expensive for the husband, and during certain periods of ancient history, being not obese was more attractive, although being chubbier was seen as attractive for certain periods of time, and it was a sign of wealth, depending on the region you lived in and the time period. Unlike their Spartan counterparts, who were rationed roughly the same amount of food per gender, Athenian women may have been forced to eat less than their male counterparts. Do note, however, there is so little literature written on the day-to-day life of Athenian women from this period that really we are basing our ideas on poems, descriptions such as out of the Odyssey. Puberty usually hit around 12 or 13, and at this time girls were ready to be married. As a signal of their childhood ending, they would gather up all their toys and bring them to the temple of Artemides. Both boys and girls placed toys, such as spinning tops, hoops, seesaws, and other items. In the Glyptothek Museum in Munich, wow, I probably even said that one wrong, there is a gravestone of Plangon, which depicts an Athenian girl holding a doll, just to prove a point of this ritual. Traditionally, marriage would occur around 14 or 15 for Athenian girls, whereas the men would roughly be double their age, where we're talking 30. This, in contrast to Sparta, was vastly different, as Spartan men and women married roughly at the same age, which was well into their 20s, as it was believed to produce stronger offspring. Once married, the Athenian girl would almost never go out into public, subsisting in seclusion and only interacting within the household. In classical Athens, women ideally remained apart from men in every possible circumstance. Okay, therefore in classical Athens, women and men were segregated as much as possible. It was the ideal for respectable women to remain out of the public eye. Priestesses were the only group of women to be exempt from this rule. This respectable behavior even held implications for women during court cases, particularly involving inheritance cases, i.e., you need to be unseen at home to have any respect in society if you're a woman. In reality, this was the case only for certain wealthy families. Logically, as you may have determined, if you were a less wealthy woman, you would be pretty much forced out of the house for various tasks, such as, fetching water from the well, wash clothes, sell things in the market, or to go work in the fields. The scholar Kostas Velopoulos has postulated that the agora may have been an area where women and men could interact. Even respectable women would emerge on certain ritual occasions where they might interact with men. Thesmophoria, an important festival to Demeter, was restricted to women and organized/conducted by Athenian women. There is literary evidence that the female seclusion may have extended even within the house itself. There does seem to be evidence of separate men's and women's quarters in Athenian homes. For instance, on the murder of Eratosthenes, Ephilotos says the women's quarters are above the men's, while Xenophon states in Eoconomicus that they are on the same level as the men's quarters, separated by a bolted door. Archaeological evidence suggests that this boundary was not as rigidly defined as literary evidence suggests. Lisa Nevet argues that Athenian women were in reality only restricted to women's quarters when unrelated men visited. It is likely that this was for times when unrelated men made visits to the household and the woman needed to be out of sight. So just to contrast somewhat, as most of you might have guessed, Spartan women walked around freely in their city and they were very much in the public eye. They would have even rode horses around their estate while tending to the helots. Those are the slave laborers, for those who don't know. Athenian women strove so much to be out of the public eye that apparently for the fortunate wealthy few, carriages would move them around with curtains over them to cover them. This would also play out with the common dress code. If you have seen my video on Spartan women, you would remember they wore quite daring apparel. This really marked Spartan women from the rest of Greece, and particularly Athens. Spartan women wore the Dorian peplos, which was made of a heavy woolen material that was common in Ionia. The Dorian peplos was fastened at the shoulders by pins called fibulae. Now, while the peplos was more of a conservative fashion, aka old school archaic for Greece at the time, they made modifications for it. Spartan women strove to wear less, and their peplos was quite loose and open, which bared their legs constantly, creating the old thigh shower stereotype attributed to them. Now, they did not only wear the Doric peplos, they in fact wore a differing short chiton when exercising if they were not doing so in the nude in front of their male counterparts, which they often did. They also wore a very short chiton for horseback riding, which Athenian women were forbidden from doing. Overall, Spartan women were considered scanty and skimpy dressers compared to their counterparts in Greece. Athenian women wove for the oikos, that's the family, a peplos for the goddess Athena annually. It was a dedication to her. This cloth for the peplos would have been around 2.4 to about 2.3 meters. That's huge. For classical Athens, there was an ongoing fashion battle between the chiton and the peplos. The Ionian chiton was adopted by Athenian women over the peplos, also known as the Dorian chiton, to make this even more confusing to you, I bet, because it did not require safety pins. According to an Athenian tradition, the fashion came about after a disastrous Athenian attack on Aegina, when a sole survivor returned home to a very unwelcoming crowd of Athenian women, wearing peploses and using their safety pins to stab him to death. This incident was reported by Herodotus, so let's take that with a grain of salt, or an entire belt of scotch, as he was known to be the father of lies. The truth remains, though, that the Ionian chiton and peplos came in and out of fashion many times. For instance, the peplos comes back into fashion after the Persian Wars. Now, I could go on forever about fashion, but let me summarize. The Ionian chiton was more like a gown than a tunic, and it was intricately draped with many folds and pleats. It was sleeveless with a single rectangular piece of fabric. Some were made from silk, most from wool. The peplos of Athens was an oblong swath of woolen cloth, first folded horizontally so that the top quarter was turned back, and then was double folded from top to bottom. It was fastened to the shoulders by safety pins or buttons. Usually it was accompanied by a belt, so it would not be loose and revealing, as the Spartan women liked to flash their thighs. It's funny to think that the Spartans were considered very radically conservative, even clothing-wise, yet the women made sure to show off as much as they could at the same time. Yet again, in case you did not watch my video on Spartan women, I would recommend you doing so, because we're getting to the wedding part of this, which was very strange and interesting for Sparta. So to butcher this and to summarize it, the Spartan men were not living with their family. They lived in a military barrack, which all of them did so from about the age of 21 to 31. The rather odd marriage ceremony was as follows. The bride shaved her head like a boy of the Agog, that's the military barracks, donned men's clothing, presumably a chiton of the Agog, and waited alone in the dark at home. The bridegroom came alone, creeping after curfew, and then took her, sneaking her back into the barracks, making care of not letting anybody know. The woman would be relatively the same age as the man, probably in their 20s, and there was no dowry. Because the men could not live at home until 31, and would often be at war anyways, the women more or less controlled the household, and this even permitted Spartan women to inherit property. Spartan women were educated and expected to perform the business of running a household, which was quite difficult. It was important to Spartan code that husband and wife would conceive when they were physically at their best. This was seen in their mid-20s or so. If a Spartan man could not produce a child, he, by law, would have to go find another man to sleep with his wife in order to do so. Interestingly, if a Spartan man was of a very much older age, it was often the case that he was forced immediately by law to find a younger Spartan man to sleep with his wife. They were this concerned with the code. But now, in classical Athens, men generally did not marry until their early 30s, and it would be rare for an Athenian man to marry without having a lot of prior sexual experience. It was common for boys to be in homosexual relations with older boys or men, and usually this was done by their pedagogical tutors, as was the same in Sparta, mind you. I must make a note of that. Once boys reached maturity, they ceased to be the object of older men and became the predators of younger boys, as it were. And this was not to say it was always like this, but it was common practice in Greece. Prostitutes were always readily available as well. But eventually a man must marry to produce an heir, and by many accounts, this was done reluctantly. Yeah, men loved men in Greece at that time. So it was interesting. Usually an Athenian would look for a man or family that would be politically useful for him, or at least pay a handsome dowry. It is highly unlikely that a bridegroom would have seen any bride candidate prior. As has been mentioned, they lived in seclusion. If they were respectable, marriage negotiations would have been conducted by the prospect bride's male guardian, which is simply her brother or father. And after the dowry was paid to the groom, the bride would be collected and removed to the groom's home in a joyful ceremony accompanied by singing, music, dancing, and feasting, which more or less was promoting a kidnapping of a young child. So, for the Athenian groom, little changed other than the presence of a wife in the household. Brides were selected as soon as they reached puberty, thus many were half the age of their husbands, around 13 to 14. The husband was still allowed to visit brothels, and it was his contractual right to sleep with slave girls if he wanted. The Athenian woman, or girl, mind you, would be kept indoors and would have a much smaller diet than the males, particularly lacking in meat, fish, and particularly wine. They had basically no say in the matter of marriage and would be given to a complete stranger. Once part of the new household, she was not allowed to control an amount of money worth more than a bushel of grain, and considered a disgrace to be seen standing in the doorway of the house, much less outside. It is estimated that Athenian women bore 6 children on average. Wow! If the woman was raped or seduced by someone, her husband was required by law to divorce her, even against his will, if need be. Not to drown over and over about how horrible Athens is, this marriage situation honestly was actually the norm in the region. So let's not just point fingers at Athens, but Athens is a great viewing point. And we'll exclude the odd cross-dressing behavior of Sparta, as that was kind of the unique one in Greece. So, classical Athens had 3 subclasses: Athenians, the citizens as it were, medics, those are foreigners of the state who happen to be there for a certain period of time, and slaves. Each had different rights and obligations. To summarize, Athenians could not be made into slaves, while medics could. Women, however, were not considered full citizens. Understand that there is some scholarly argument on this subject still. But as far as full participation in the polis is concerned, we will consider Athenian women not full citizens for this video. It makes it easier. For most cases, Athenian women had the same rights and responsibilities as men. However, they had significant disability in law compared to men. Like slaves and medics, they did not hold political freedom and were excluded from the law, courts, and assembly. If an Athenian wife was seen to comment on her husband's involvement in politics, she would be reprimanded. For instance, Aristotle's play, Lysistrata, suggests such reprimands. You can imagine. In Athenian court, all juries were male. Women could not appear as litigants, but were represented by their kyrios. If none available, some other man would come forward. This was basically just her legal guardians. Medic women, however, have been shown to appear in court cases on their behalf and could initiate legal action. But this could be because these medics were really important foreigners and it was probably a unique situation. The political sphere of classical Athens did not have room for women. The assembly was made for men only. Although women were formally prevented from participating in the democratic process, Kostos Philassopoulos suggests they were possibly exposed to political debate in the agora. There does seem to be instances of women involving themselves in public affairs. For instance, Plutarch's Life of Pericles tells 2 stories about, I apologize, Elpenense's public actions, one where she criticized Pericles for making war against other Greek cities, and the other where she pleaded with him not to persecute her brother, Cimon, on charges of treason. Overall, an Athenian woman was legally the property of her father until she was married to a husband and then became his property. It was very difficult for women to divorce men, while for the later it was quite simple. If a divorce occurred, the woman would be returned to her family with her dowry returned. The children would remain with the father. If the woman committed adultery, the dowry would not be returned. Women would lose all rights to their children, regardless. For a woman to divorce her husband, she would have to endeavor to find an archon and provide good reasons for divorce to be granted. A man, however, could simply stop all of this by confining the woman to her home, so you can imagine how often women succeeded in getting a divorce. Yep. All property rights were to the father and or the husband. Any property that she may have inherited would go directly to the husband if she was married. Now, technically, an Athenian woman could inherit property if she was the closest surviving relative, but could not contractually acquire or dispose of this. Thus, no, they really couldn't own property. And I know there's some scholars who argue points about this, but to simplify this video, I can't really go into it. Let's just say that they can't own property. It's a very long and difficult discussion. All right. She was also forbidden from entering a contract worth more than a medmenos of barley, enough to feed an average family for 6 days. Ironically, the dowry system was a double-edged sword. If the dowry for a wife was larger than the husband's wealth, it gave her some influence in the household. This is simply because the man could not afford to divorce her, so she could use this to blackmail him a little bit. So to contrast and summarize, Spartan women controlled the household and estate, mostly because the men were always away. Aristotle was critical and criticized Spartan women for their wealth and authority. The Spartan law codified under Lycurgus expressed that childbearing was an equal role to being a male warrior in the army. Whether Spartan women were legally the inheritors of property or not is argued by scholars, but the fact is many were at least in control of vast amounts of property. We look no further than to Aristotle's complaints over the issue at large as evidence, where he often states that Spartan women held far too much power, and this was directly referring to how much property and land they were controlling or held. It is a bit of a complex, but it seems that Spartan women controlled vast amounts of land as a result, more so of their husbands or family members not being present. Not necessarily that they actually held the land, but it's so facto, they controlled the land regardless. And to be honest, to go just a little bit more into depth, Spartan women weren't just controlling vast estates of land. The whole Spartan system was based off of a slave system where they controlled helots. We're talking lots of helots. There was far more than the Spartan population. So Spartan women would be considered very formidable managers. This episode is going far too long and has accidentally become a pissing contest between Spartan and Athens, as almost all ancient Greek history is, to be honest. To summarize, it's not that Sparta was a gleaming beacon of feminist light. It sometimes is portrayed to be. It simply was better for females in general at that time period. Spartan women still held no official political authority. They certainly held more than any Athenian woman. Athenian women also had little to no legal rights, any economic rights, or basic human rights compared to Spartans. Imagine being stuck inside a house the majority of your life and hearing about another city-state where women not only went around freely, but did so in flimsy clothing, bearing a lot, and upon horses looking over vast estates with their slaves. It sounds like a great life. Of course, a lot of what I said here is still argued by scholars, though I tended to side with my research on Sarah Pomeroy on most issues. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And again, it was largely made because of demand, seen from the previous episode on Spartan women. If there is still a demand for more content similar to this, I have already thought of a new episode, but I'm going to leave it to you, the audience, if this is something you like. If yes, I will probably do an episode because I have quite a lot of background in Mongolian history on Mongolian women, particularly in the empire phase under, I'll say Genghis Khan, but it's probably going to be more about Kublai Khan during that time period, because there's strikingly similar instances, and comparing them to Spartan women would be interesting, even though the periods are very far apart. I think it could make for a good episode. With saying that, I hope you enjoyed. Please leave some comments below, and let's see if I can get the bird to say failure. This has been MBS History.